Okay.
Well,
Here we
welcome
go.
everybody.
Yeah.
We're starting. We're looking at Bateson's.
So it turned out to be the actual core of the double bind explanation, because there is a later chapter called the double bind that I assumed was but this was actually the meat of it was here.
Yes, he the toward the theory of schizophrenia, and then there's a brief intro, the epidemiology of schizophrenia, and I think he does lay it out. And also, I think Nora in her
essay,
old Growth
she
Redwoods.
does just
Yeah,
a little bit of it in the poem too.
yeah. I'm going to quote from her to start off, and there's another, just a couple of quotations at the beginning, just as an intro. And I also posted this morning scenes from Ordinary People.
Yeah, I just watched that. It was great. It was really, really good.
I can't add to that, really. I mean, it was so Batesonian.
I don't know. Did you remember it from the?
Yeah.
Because I mean, I would never have been able to dug out a sequence like that from a video.
As I was reading this this chapter this morning, and all this binds and double binds, and I was feeling this knot in my stomach, because it really does have that effect on you. When you start to read this stuff and go deep into it, you start to realize how incredibly slippery and complex. And then all of a sudden I remembered that movie, and I said, I hope I can find this movie.
And how present it is in our everyday lives. It's not just that this happens to these, people with mental illness off in the corner there. This is all around us all the time, this kind of thing, right?
That's right. That's right. And when does it become pathological? Because it seems to be so pervasive. Just our everyday, ordinary discourse events are just full of them. But I think that schizophrenia we label as a special case, perhaps, of something that's more general. But some people get labeled in a certain way. And I think this is something that Bateson was looking at. Anyway, I just want to quote this from Nora. In the mirror, any man or woman might recognize the flickering beginnings of identity in a young girl just now realizing that she will be objectified by her culture. All of nature is that girl. She must begin to prepare herself. What kind of object shall I be? A precious object, a useful object, a dangerous object, a desirable object? I do not want to be a broken object, but all objects are broken. Then I'm reading from a wonderful book called Boundary Objects. The author's name is Lee Starr. She is writing, this whole book is full of Bateson. She's looking at Bateson, and specifically about this chapter, but she tells a story, I think, that really illustrates what she's calling a high tension zone. Several years ago, I taught a graduate class in feminist theory at a large university in California. The first day of class, 8 women and 1 other person showed up. I couldn't tell whether the 9th person was male or female. He gave her name as Jan, an ambiguous name. In the course of our class discussions, it turned out that Jan was considering transsexual surgery. He'd taken some hormone shots and thus began to grow breasts, and was dressing in a gender-neutral way in plain slacks and short-sleeved shirt. He said that he wasn't sure if he wanted to go ahead with the surgery, that he was enjoying the experience of being ambiguous gender-wise. It's like being in a very high-tension zone, as if something's about to explode. She said one day, people can't handle me this way. They want me to be one thing or another. But also it's great. I'm learning so much about what it means to be neither one nor the other. When I pass as a woman, I begin to understand what feminism is all about. But this is different somehow. I was deeply moved by Jan's description of the high-tension zone, though I didn't really know what to make of it at the time. A few weeks into the class, we became friends, and she told me more about the process she was going through. She worked for one of the high-technology firms in Silicon Valley, one that offered very good health insurance. but the health insurance company, Blue Cross, was unsure about paying for the extremely expensive process of transsexual surgery. Furthermore, the gender identity clinic, where Jan was receiving psychotherapy and the hormone shots, was demanding that she dress more like a conventionally feminine woman to prove that he was serious in her desire for the surgery. She told me that they had required you to live for 2 years passing as a woman. So she summarizes this in the following, and then the surgery was completed. So she made the transition. And she says, in the years that followed, I saw Jan's, now Janis, name once in a while in a local feminist club announcement. She became an active leader in the women in business groups in the area. I never saw her again after that February, but continued to be haunted by the juxtaposition of the delicate high tension zone. I think that sort of resonated for me with what was what Nora was trying to express. As she talks about dealing with herself as an object, looking in the mirror and objectifying herself, and recognizing that all objects are broken. And then one other thing, and then I'll open this up to the floor, and wherever you guys want to start with this, it's fine with me because it's extremely complex. But I think Bateson's model, once again, I'm quoting from Lee Starr, she's talking about first order, second order, third order. And first order, the cat is on the mat. That's a message. This is another another message. I was lying when I said the cat is on the mat. And then there's a third level. This is the listener. How does the listener make sense of these two messages? The listener could respond with, there are many conflicting approaches to evaluating whether or not you were lying about the cat and the mat. That would be a person who is able to make these subtle distinctions between these levels. Most children are not able to do this. So if you're having you're in an environment where adults are giving you double messages, it's very rare. No child is able to step outside of that system, but they do embody that they're being lied to, or that they're being given a double message, or even a triple message. And some children, make decisions early on. These people are crazy, and I need to get out of here as soon as I can. That was my response. But a lot of people, and I hunkered down and waited until I could escape the booby hatch, which I did. And I found other people who were refugees as well. And we all came to the East Village and hung out for a couple of decades and had a great time. But I think that, I was very lucky. But, a lot of people went to psychiatrists, or they went to doctors, or they went into a medical system, and they were diagnosed with homosexuality. That was a mental illness in those days, at any rate. And they were treated for a medical condition. And so I'm looking at this very poignantly at those of us who were able to recognize we were in a crazy system and get out of it, and those who were not able to, and who were labeled and dismissed and turned into experimental guinea pigs, given all kinds of drugs and shock treatments, et cetera, et cetera. I think this is the kind of schizophrenia I think that Bateson was looking at is different from what we would call schizophrenia. I think there's been a kind of transformation. And I think what people are calling schizophrenia now is medicated. And I've known a few people who were diagnosed with this, and I'm sort of familiar with some of the protocols that were used. And anyway, I'm really open to your experiences, and you know, you work for organizations, both of you, and you probably have uh, all kinds of stories to tell about the double messages that you've given and received. I really do think it's very difficult to survive at all in our culture if you are not able to give double messages. And some of these are creative, like I'm joking, I'm kidding, you know, I'm offering a message about this message. And that makes, I think, our social lives possible if we can respond in creative ways to the double messages that sometimes we're required to give to people. If you've worked in an organization, you know that you have a message to deliver to the public, and this is your job. And even though there are lots of novel situations that arise, you have to make judgments about how to deal with this because it's not in the manual. You know, there's no rule that that gives me any guidance about how I need to behave. So I've been in those kind of situations, and I'm sure the two of you have as well. So I wonder if we could just open this up to examine this very slippery topic and maybe create some fresh new ideas about it. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I just wanted to add just one line from the Nora's poem, River's Muscle, where she says, I ask you to be loyal to your own transformations while I shift and twist in mine. Which is very much, it's interesting because the discussion we had last night in the writers group, we were talking about Marco's poem, and I was shifting and twisting while I was listening to Marco talk about his dress, you know, because I'm going through a lot of things right now, all about this kind of stuff. And in fact, the quote about gender and issues around gender is the heart of what I'm struggling with right now. So, yeah. So in that regard, you know, I think the way we deal with gender is exactly what Bateson is describing, and it's systematic across our society. You know, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't around gender. You can't, there's nobody who's getting a get out of jail free card in that particular area, I don't think.
Right.
So I think it's very relevant.
It's a primary bind that is laid on all of us, and you're either this or you're that.
Exactly.
There's nothing in between, and we all know most of us live in the in between.
and also this confusion, and you hear it in that discussion of the case that was made against that person, where in order to get the surgery, you have to go extreme towards one side, which is totally ridiculous. I mean, and it confuses the issues about, to some extent, about, because that was a big issue for me, sexual orientation and gender identity. When I first started to question gender identity, I was told by experts in the area, well, if you're sexually oriented towards women, then you're not gender, you're not anything else but a standard male. But it's got nothing to, the two things have got nothing to do with each other.
Right.
But it took me years to untangle that.
Right.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, I'm still waiting for the day that I can advocate for bodiless embodiment. That's what I was getting at with the Manning discussions in the past, and there's just so much going on and so much we can be, and we're broken down. Even the best of us who want to be, or who have time to contemplate on how to be and what to be, still can't get there. We're always going to have a little piece missing, or a shattered framework or something like that. But you asked for stories, and my wife went back to work 2 weeks ago as an office assistant in a mental health facility. But on the rides home, I used to work in a similar situation, so I've been reawakened to the underbelly of the mental health industry and the insanity. And my case within the jury was a disability case, but it wasn't for a typical disability case of someone seeking disability for physical or mental. She was kind of in between. She had supreme depression, multiple diagnoses. She had been adopted at age 13, and it sounded, based on her testimony, she had been abused financially by that family, or extorted for her income from the state. And so she kind of gave up. She was completely boxed in. And the whole time this was going on, there were testimonies from various attorneys or but one of the psychiatrists explained how this girl is on so much medication, and it was supposed to be just a quick cut dry case. Okay, well, she's going to get guardianship because that's what everybody wants, even the girl wants that. But there's no talk of future. There's no talk of, well, she'll have guardianship, but there's no chance for her to become a human. This broken girl doesn't have a chance to rebuild into some other framework. But this psychiatrist made us aware that she is an outside the box thinker. And she originally had to talk to the girl, literally a box separating her because she had threatened to kill herself. So she had to be enclosed. So that's what this girl is under, and what people trying to help her have to work with, this big system of boxings and boxings and more boxings. And even with this case closed, it's going to be another 2 or 3 years before she can personally review guardianship to be on her own. She was living on her own for 4 years. But I was thinking of Bateson the whole time, or of our discussions here, of thinking outside the box, of boundaries, and she's not a unique case. This is happening all over the place, with adoption, with diagnoses for mental depression, for bipolar, schizophrenia, whatever it might be. So medication is thrown out. So what are the alternatives? I don't know. And I've been reading Nathan on the side. So I think both of you have glanced at it, maybe not recently, or have read it. But he talks about how the Yatmal women are cyclothymic. So that's more bipolar thinking, I think. And then he classifies the men as schizothymic, which is almost along the lines of autistic behavior, I guess interior. And then I almost imagine that the shaman of the tribe would be the interior exterior rather than the high-low. I don't know. So I was looking for more clarity on how Bateson's original ideas have trickled into where we are now in this complexity, in this. So it's not even labeling it on male, female, as we're talking about here, is very limiting. Although it's an insight, but we've kind of branched out multiple times. So how do we rein that in? I'll stop there. I'm reminded of something else, but I'll save that for later.
Well, I hate to go into story time, but I have another memory. When I was in my first year in college, I was living with a man. We started off like romantically involved. He was older than I was, and I was just getting out of high school when I met him. And I was thrown out of the house when I was I believe it was a senior high school. It was the end of high school. Anyway, because I let my family know. I actually smuggled a letter, and where I described this affair that I was having. And I knew my father would find it, and when he did, he did what he did what I wanted him to do, which was throw me out of the house. So I wanted so badly to get out of there, but I was still underage, so I had a hard time creating the conditions so that I could get out of there. Because I knew if I ran away, they would lock me up. But if he threw me out, then I was free. So I put him in a double bind where he would have to create, he would erupt and throw me out. He was a brutal, cruel man. I hated his guts. And when he died, I felt nothing but relief. This is sad to say that about your father, but it's true. He was a brutal, cruel person. But I remember something very moving about, he told me that he wished I'd never been born than to be a queer. And I said, well, luckily for me, not everyone feels that way. And he says, so I said goodbye. And he says, where are you going? And I said, I'm going to live with Roger. And he was shocked. And he said, well, get in the car, I'll drive you. And I said, no, he lives right around the corner. You know, I can walk. My father insisted that he drive me to this destination, which was, you know, my boyfriend, basically. And I remember getting out of the car, going into the apartment where my boyfriend lived, and looking outside, and my father was sitting in the car for half an hour. Then he turned the car and he drove away. And I find that so moving in a way, because I realized my father was in a bind. He had put me into binds and triple binds since I was 3 years old. And then I had put him in a bind. And he didn't know how to process this new relationship that I was making very clear to him. And at any rate, I look back on this as a successful intervention of a person who had been put in binds and mini binds, and how I was able to creatively create conditions where I could use those binds to my advantage. And so I'm moved by this last remark in this particular essay on schizophrenia. He's talking about therapists who can enter the weave. Well, he also talks about there are some people who are creative when they get put in these binds rather than just getting in a straitjacket and taking the drugs or getting the shock treatments. They actually break out and they create their own communities, which is what I think the gay movement and the LGBTQ movement was really all about. How we negotiate in very, very creative ways all of these multiple binds by the state, by the church, by the medical establishment. They were all unified in discriminating against gay people, legally discriminating against gay people. And I think this is a triumphant story, because those legal discriminations are no longer on the books, and the sodomy laws have been taken off. Supreme Court has apologized. So I think this is hopefully, an exercise in how culture can shift. And we're still in the midst of huge double binds and triple binds on the global level now, because this isn't just tribal tribal get-togethers with their rules and regulations and their hidden agendas, which is what culture basically is. It's all the understated and hidden assumptions that we make. Because now we're in a global environment, and we have these communications that we're enjoying right now, and a lot of this technology is, of course, as we know, subliminal messages are everywhere, and creating all kinds of intended and unintended consequences. So I think this is what's so challenging. There's something he says at the end of this particular essay. He's talking about psychotherapists and how there are some therapists who use double binds in a creative way. And he gives an example. And then he says, many of the uniquely, he says he therefore can set up relatively benevolent binds. He's talking about this successful therapist, and gradually aid the patient in his emancipation from the binds. Many of the uniquely appropriate therapeutic gambits arranged by the therapist seem to be intuitive. We share the goal of most psychotherapists who strive toward the day when such strokes of genius will be well enough understood to be systematic and commonplace. So I think that when I look at the binds and double binds and how I've been able to maneuver and create conditions for liberation for myself and others, it's because one of the ingredients is I've been able to triangulate from the margins. And this is tricky because there's more than one margin. And if you can enter into the weave of that schizoid system and create and respond to the boundary, the boundary objects, which could be abstract or concrete, then you have some leverage. And so this is something we covered in our conversation with Deborah Loeffler this last week in the cafe. Doug and I were interviewing Deborah Loeffler, and there was a discussion about this, and how I think Deborah Loeffler, as a sociologist, is looking at the cultural dynamic that we're in right now, this transition to a technological civilization, and how there's a post-capitalist, post-money phase that we're entering into as these binds start to create the conditions for something different. And this is a big transition humanity is making. And I don't think there's any guarantee that we're going to make it. But it does appear that, with the coral reefs dying rapidly, that there may be enough people who are motivated will start to pay real good attention, really exquisite attention to what's happening. So anyway, I think this is also, I think of a person like Jesus. I think he exquisitely worked with a bind when they were going to stone the adulterous woman, and he intervened, and he just said, "He who is without sin cast the first stone." And everybody froze and basically just walked home. And there was the woman who had been accused, and he said, "Who hath condemned thee, woman?" And she said, "No man, Rabbi." And he said, "Neither do I condemn thee. Go thy ways in peace." And I'm reporting this story because I think it was Jay Haley, who was a psychotherapist that worked intimately with Bateson and with Mead and with Erickson, that this was an example of a creative bind. Because Jesus didn't say adultery is cool. Commit adultery all you want to. He asked another question. which was he who is without sin, which would be blasphemous at that point. He had reframed this social event so that is another, that's a message about the original message. And I think that's what, this is an example, I'm sure we could think of many others, of a very successful intervention by someone, and I think Jesus was pretty adept at how he was able to, like a great performance artist, he could enter into these liminal spaces with large groups of people and create these kind of interesting binds. He could point attention to these binding patterns and sort of compel people to look at their own behavior in a way that they had not done before. So I'm just putting that out there. I hope that other people can come up with some examples from your own life or from history. Thanks.
He sort of, Bateson sort of, he doesn't actually say it, but he sort of half suggests that the only way out of a double bind may be through benevolent double binds. That is to say, how do you untangle a double bind once it's in place? Because as he points out, you can't just act on the individual because the individual is in the context, and the context will come back and recorrect the correction. So you can't, you know, this is part of the whole idea of a double bind is a systems problem, not an individual problem. And if you don't address it at the systems level, you can't correct it. Right. And so I think maybe he's not saying that the benevolent double bind is the only way out, but you have to address it at the systems level rather than through individual therapy. So part of his argument was that in order to deal with these contexts, you have to engage with the family and not just with the individual in order to.
And that's the tricky thing, because where do you put the circle?
Around where? And of course, society, all of society, and this is the problem that we have with many of and even I was thinking about, you know, I mean, the situation around homosexuality is a good prototype example. You can have well-intentioned people who can do a certain amount of things, but you can't change the whole attitudes of the system just through the actions of well-intentioned people. The only way you can change the system is if you mount a campaign that addresses the double binds there, you know, in the way that the gay movement did exactly that, right? So, it's an argument in favor of protest movements of that kind of thing. In order to exercise change at the social level, you must go through that mechanism, because any other more individual engagement will not get you there, you know. So and there's a flip side to it, the argument too, which is that I say this, but I have trouble with it, a little bit like, you know, I have my issues with my mother, who for many, many years of my life I believed was a very generous, saintly kind of person, until it finally dawned on me that something else was going on there. And I discovered the nether side of what was going on in my relationship with my mother. It took me quite a long time to untangle the issues. And, you know, so this is a case where, and it's part of my interest in these issues about untangling what happened to her as a young girl, because in terms of trauma in the war, in the Second World War, and because I think to some extent she acted the way that she did because she went through some very difficult experiences as a young girl, and those molded her character. And so when she became a parent, all of those things went through into the relationship with her kids. And so to an extent, there's a kind of she couldn't help it, you know. But that's hard. That's hard. You know, it's hard to know whether you can't just de-responsibilize the person. You can't do that. You know, she's just as responsible for her behavior. But there are reasons that she got into that situation, and so to counter that, you have to engage with this sort of double bind, benevolent double bind behavior in order to, you know, address the way. So I mean, even that in that film clip, it's not at all clear just from watching the film what the hell the boy can do in order to get out of that circumstances. There's nothing obvious about it, right? So,
well, in the movie, what happens is he falls in love with a girl who he meets in a therapy group, who's been diagnosed as crazy, and so they both accept their mutual diagnosis and do something creative with it, and they fall in love and they have a relationship, and I think that saves his life. He can see through the bullshit that his parents are cranking out. In those brief scenes, you can see the father is as clueless as anybody. And I think this would be proving the theory that Bateson offers, is how fathers you can't go to the father for support because he's as caught up in the bind as
anybody else. In fact, and you know, I mean, it took me years to figure out that the reason I went to the other end of the country from my family had its roots in this situation. You know, it took me years to understand that I actually fled my family without realizing that's what I did. You know, and put 5,000 kilometers between me and my mother, you know, for 20 years, 30 years.
Yeah, there's a deep wisdom in that, though. And I think that's, well, I think that how do you begin to even talk about this stuff? It's so complicated. But I think if you can start to unravel it just a little bit, and once again, from the margins, if you can triangulate from the margins, you might be able to have some wiggle room. I just quoted in the Last Cafe, James Lawley. He's a mentor of mine who taught me most about double binds. He also taught me clean language. And he said, it's like two gunslingers at high noon. They're going to, you know, have a duel. Neither one of them wants to get shot. Neither one of them wants to shoot the other. But there they are. And one of them, very slowly, pulls his gun out of his holster and drops it on the ground. So that's like a sign, a signal to the other person. And the other person smiles, acknowledges this gesture, and indicates, let's go into the saloon and have a drink. And then from a rooftop, a voice comes and says, with a rifle, the first man who refuses to fight, I'm going to shoot that man. So this is the structure of a triple bind. So the original bind, which is ready to dissolve, is held in place by someone who's outside of that bind, but wants to maintain that bind. I believe it's not too easy to sort of see this pattern on the global stage. How, you know, these binds, the original bind, which might unravel itself, gets held in place by forces that want to maintain that bind. So this I think is sort of the structure of capitalism and how it works. And I believe that Davor Loeffler is saying it's not working anymore. And we're seeing all these exaggerations of Brexit and the Trump presidency, and Manafort, who just testified in Congress about the dark side of the Trump administration. I mean, you're seeing all of this coming out into the open. So it's harder and harder for these ruling elites to create these kind of puppet, trying to create the population like puppets on a string, trying to maintain these binding patterns in a age like ours where we have the internet and we have access to more kinds of knowledge than we've ever had before. This can create overwhelm and distress because we also have, we're exposed to more double binds and triple binds than ever before. And I think that if there are enough of us who try to re-educate ourselves and start making alliances with others who we may not have thought we had much in common with, but now I think we're starting to see, oh, well, the coral reefs are dying rapidly. This might be something that we all have shared. This could create a lot of motivation for us to think differently. And so that's probably what keeps me coming to these events, studying Bateson and studying Sloterdijk and studying Aurobindo and looking at Gebser. I think these are all these kind of macro historians, I think that, we have a lot of leverage that we probably just don't think is worth the effort because we're so absorbed by these ways to distract ourselves and get caught up in these nihilistic, passive and aggressive forms of nihilism. It just doesn't matter what I do. I'm a worm. I'm going to be crushed by these forces that are so much bigger than me. So I'm just going to hunker down and have another beer and watch TV. And I think these are very real responses that people are having. They're just shutting down because they're just overwhelmed and they find ways of numbing themselves. And so I think that Nora is very alert to this. I thought she was wonderful in that interview, which she took down, because she basically said, there's nothing in the past really that's going to help us now. The past, all these, to turn to the traditions and look for something that's going to work, she thought is sort of more or less folly, because we're in unprecedented kinds of situations now. So we're going to have to pull something magical is going to have to happen.
A rabbit out of the hat.
Yeah. But I think we've been created before. And this is what David Loeffler is looking at the history of transformations in culture. And he was like saying in like the axial age, they could not possibly understand the kinds of things we take for granted, like money, like capitalism, like the internet. This would be like bizarre to them. And he's suggesting that the transition that we're all going through right now, that the post-capitalist, the post-money world will be weird to us right now as our current situation would be to someone in the axial age. I mean, it's like we have to really, it's going to be very, very different world than the one we're in now. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people just are not ready to think that far ahead. That future that he's calling, what did he call it, Doug? Something about the anterior future. He says, we are the past of that anterior future. So we're sort of doing this sort of reverse engineering. Well, that's why I keep saying, what would you like to have happen? When this and this and this, and all of it sucks, what do you want to have happen? I believe we have to make our imaginations front and center here, because there may be nothing in our current situation that's going to get us out of it. And this is what I experienced as a gay person when I was a child. It's like there was nothing, absolutely nothing in my environment that could give me any guidance whatsoever, except when I went to bed at night. Right before I fell asleep, I would imagine something different, that there was a place, some place, somewhere for me and for people like me. Little did I know it was in the East Village of New York City. But as an adult, when I heard about it, the Stonewall riots, which happened a few blocks from where I live now, I went, I want to go there. And I did. And that's, I think, what saved my life, actually, and my sanity. I wasn't insane, but I was living in an insane system. And I think many of us now are recognizing that this system is insane.
Yeah. Well, we've essentially realized that the gun has no trigger. The guy on the roof.
He ran out of ammo.
Ran out of ammo, no trigger, but there's so many other individuals still shooting at each other because they haven't heard the message, or they can still get beat over the head constantly by systems of, hey, you have to work, or you have to donate your body to make any money, whatever the story is. And yeah, I'm wondering where the benevolent rooftop person comes in. How do we have that person or system or movement come into play to influence more and more individuals?
I think you need to go to a third order, actually. And I think there needs to be somebody, and I don't think this will be benevolent, actually. I think someone else with a gun has to shoot that gun.
And it can be a virtual gun.
I know you're a peace-loving man, Douglas. I'm not.
Or we could get rid of
I'm here to discriminate.
But Bateson talked about the Zen Cohen thing, where the answer is to take the gun away from the person who's, or the stick or whatever it is. And so it's the thing that one doesn't think of. I must admit, I've listened to those Zen Cohens for about 30 years, and I never thought until I read the Bateson's argument that the answer is to take the stick away from the the person. So because we don't think about that.
Can I read that? The effect of the double bind, what you just described? Yeah. In the Eastern religion, Zen Buddhism, the goal is to achieve enlightenment. The Zen master attempts to bring about enlightenment in his pupil in various ways. One of the things he does is to hold a stick over the pupil's head and say fiercely, if you say this stick is real, I will strike you with it. If you say the stick is not real, I will strike you with it. If you don't say anything, I will strike you with it. We feel that the schizophrenic finds himself continually in the same situation as the pupil, but he achieves something like disorientation rather than enlightenment. The Zen pupil might reach up and take the stick away from the master, who might accept this response, but the schizophrenic has no such choice, since with him there is no not caring about the relationship, and his mother's aims and fairness are not like the master's. So I think that's, my feeling is, I've been confronted with bullies all my life. And when you smack them really hard, they stop it.
Yeah.
I think it's almost universal. I'm guilty of the universalization here, but I think when you do to the bully what the bully wants to do to everybody else, the bully stops. And that sometimes you cannot negotiate in a violent situation. When someone's has a rock and aiming it at your head, you can't say, hey, I think I appreciate where you're coming from. You stop the violence. And I think gay people are very peaceful people, but we know that, there are some situations that are extremely violent and that we've been in, and we have war stories. But, I think it's not going to be, none of this is going to be solved by a committee, no matter how enlightened. There are going to be individuals who are going to enter into the fray, and they're going to maybe be targeted. But if there are enough whistleblowers, the whistleblowers often don't get rewarded for their whistleblowing.
No,
but it benefits the system enormously. But I'm wondering, how can we, if we don't want to support the status quo, what do we do? And I think so many efforts have been co-opted by these puppet masters, the spin meisters, and that's going to be, I think, an ongoing tension, a high tension zone that many of us are feeling. But I think Davor was interesting because he says the CEO is just a slot in the matrix.
Well, that's what I was saying. people it's easy to maintain the status quo because the status quo is designed to reinforce these double binds, and the system knows how to do that. So you just do what the system is already set up to do, and of course that's easy. But as you say, one can be creative in the way that in somewhat the way Bateson describes, and set up double binds that don't do what the system automatically leads to. But it requires a lot of creativity to do that. Mind you, maybe that's a good thing because, enhancing our ability to be creative is going to be the way that we're going to get out of the problem. So anything that we do to enhance our creativity, and so it's one of the reasons why I think, even though sort of paying attention to so one's need for self-expression, for instance, which is part of these movements and part of these issues, but somehow in order to do that, you need to draw on your own creativity. And of course, the very fact, so you're learning to learn in Bateson terms, or learning to learn, which is the second order effect, right? So that you're taking yourself out of these situations where there are no alternatives, right? Which is what the double bind is about, right? So even though, of course, the problem with the double bind, and Bateson is very clear about this, is that the reason why it is a double bind is because it's a survival issue. It's a double bind because if you don't, because the danger is if you try to challenge the system and step out of it, you will die. Yeah, that's what makes it hard. So you can be creative, but you have to run the risk.
Well, this is what I think the value of art is art gives us tacit permission to enter into these liminal zones and create liminal products out of those liminal zones. So we have plays, we have poetry, we have music, we have art. These are all those areas that are allowed, and that nurture these kinds of creative opportunities to shift, because and I know this is what Tennessee Williams was doing. He was gay. He was a playwright. He didn't write any. He just started to write about a potential gay relationship in, I can't remember the name of that play, but most of his characters, his women characters, are very compelling. Think about Edward Albee, who wrote "Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf,"
or about Marcel Proust, who has all these feminine characters all through his book, but they're actually masculine characters that have been feminized.
That's right. So there's odd characterizations that have an ambiguity to them, his female characters, and some of his male characters. So it's that ambiguity. And I think that, if you have a certain kind of sensibility, you're going to be drawn to that kind of artistry. And there's going to be certain musicians and certain performers. And I think right now we're seeing lots of those kind of performers who are able to, who are gender fluid and who can attract large audiences, and like Gaga, and we can, that I think has effects on our politics. So I think the artists get there first, and the politicians, it may take a generation, but the politicians start to catch up, because it creates a different kind of, it creates an interior space, an what do you call that? An interplay, a second person kind of interplay between subjects, the intersubjective, and then new objects are going to emerge out of that. So, that's why I think so many people are attracted to the arts who are a little odd and a little weird and who don't fit, and they know that. But rather than, take Prozac or get, shunted off to the asylum, they do art, and they create communities where they can use their imaginations in maybe subversive ways.
I find it difficult to determine exactly where a movement starts. So it might start with art, if that's the unknown, intuitive, creative splattering of paint onto the page. And we could say the philosopher perhaps cleans up the mess as not necessarily the mess, but maybe the muddle, and kind of pieces together these paint that after it's dried, you can reflect on it. Or there's speculative philosophy, which in its own manner is its own art. But where does it start? And then I think what we've been exploring, or what someone like Deborah Loeffler, he's saying, we're at the cusp in so many areas. So the medical field, which is mired in medication and more boxes or pill containers, or you have to do this, or the doctor says so, into outside the box thinking, or some 15-year-old can save the influenza virus for the year and prevent somebody just by playing a game that a doctor set up to explore different modes of thinking and allowing others to participate in that. So the movement, it's hard to determine when it starts, or even the Zen student who's perhaps stuck in the chair. When he hears that, maybe he gets struck once, but he's smart enough to not come back the next day and teach himself, because that Zen teacher was missing something, perhaps. Or maybe that's the Zen student becoming a master. He mastered the master. But what does he do? Where does he go from there? And yeah, I like the arts, and that's where I gravitate towards. And I'd like to see how all the other systems and circles overlap, and how that ties into this momentum that we seek, or if it's just a wave that dies back down, or if it is some sort of what direction is all this going?
Yeah, I think that's where we're the threshold. When do we? I think it's a question of timing, and when we can put pressure, and when we need to back off, and then add a little more pressure, and then we back off, and then we add a lot of pressure, and then the system reaches a threshold, and something pops, and then you look back, and you can reflect on that, because you can't go back to where you were before, because it's a different system. I think this is what I think Bateson was tracking, was these thresholds. And I think he was at the early stage of cybernetics. He was still, I think, he was what Dave Loeffler was talking about, passive. I think he calls it, what does he call it? There's a passive and active form of informationalism. So information systems, which started with Bateson in the Macy conferences. They were talking about AI back then, and looking at these complex systems emerging out of multiple, compound machines. These machines were becoming, they're no longer simple, but you need an information theory that can coordinate all of these different compound machines. And there was a passive form in the 50s and 60s, and they talked about homeostasis and feedback loops, language that I still use, and self-organization theory. But then there's the age that has started now, which is an active kind of informationalism, where we can now go in and splice genes and create new kinds of organisms, like the three-eyed beetle, which Davor mentions. They have a beetle now that can't, instead of 2 eyes, it has 3 eyes. They've done this, and what happens when you put these new kinds of critters out into an environment. This is something new that you know, our informational technology has been able to do, and will continue to probably push this forward. And I think this is where Loeffler's like looking at how these new capacities will create the conditions for the leap into what he's calling a technological civilization. And the good news is, there's a lot of bad news probably, but the good news is that the old elites, which the ruling elites who've been trying to hold it down, are going to become as obsolete as the workers that are being displaced. The cashiers we don't need, the manufacturing base is disappearing, no bank tellers are going to be needed. I mean, robots and automation are going to do all of that, but then that's true of the CEOs as well, because their whole purpose or their function has been to, you know, be the predictors and to implement all these information systems, organize them a certain way. But that, I think, is different from the traditional class war, Marxist kind of class war, where we all had to fight over who had the means of production. And I think this is what Dave was sort of putting forward in his theory, that we just need to stop thinking about replacing a bad CEO with a good CEO, because he says they're just a slot in the matrix, you know, and they're basically, any CEO is just going to maintain support for the current regimes. But that's going to wither away as more and more of this technology starts to evaporate those opportunities to hold back information and patent things, and, you know, keep your secrets guarded, because there's hackers all over the place, and they're stealing all of this and making it part of the public domain. And I think that can't be stopped, is what Dave was saying.
Yeah, and Plato, I think, said that the ideal philosopher is the spectator of all time and existence, and in a sense, that's what his theory is getting at, that with this acceleration all around us, with internet knowledge, with anything that just allows us to perceive more that's out there. You can say globalism, or thinking planetary is one aspect of it. And yeah, the CEOs are within a certain time frame or their own life frame, maybe the next generation's life frame will carry on the tradition, but that's a limited view there. And like you're saying, it's just a little slot, and it's within time, within space, and even the smallest of us can start being ideal philosophers to a certain extent within our framework. And with that's yeah, or at least I keep coming back to this movement, this cusp. I know it takes time, and I know perhaps it's not going anywhere in particular that I think it ought to or might. But it's nice to have like-minded, a we to continue in this movement towards that something. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. Then I think you said before, who spectates the spectator? So it's not set in stone. Once we do go past the cusp, we'll be set where we think we ought to be, and then the next spectator will come through and do its own thinking.
Well, I think the spectator is tricky. I seem to remember that quote from Brian Masumi, where he talks about the Bateson in the zoo looking at the two monkeys behind bars, and he was the observer, and he was objectifying the behavior of the monkeys, and Masumi's coming along and looking at Bateson and putting the circle, he's putting the circle in a different place than Bateson. Bateson's putting the circle around the two monkeys. Masumi's putting the circle around the two monkeys and Bateson. And I think that kind of who's the spectator kind of question is a big one. And I think I apologize, Geoffrey, if we were talking a lot about Davor Loeffler, but our whole cafe was about him. And his view is a very, I think Plato outlined it. He was basically looking at the view from nowhere. And I believe Loeffler is talking about, we're looking at the view from everyone, actually, or everybody. Sort of paraphrasing, I think, something that Marco has said repeatedly. And I think that is indicative of the shift that's happening, because Plato lived in a world of slaves, not workers. The slaves, and there was profits made in the Greek era. The profits were saved. The profits were not invested in capital. And what happened when the machines went from being simple, there were simple machines in Plato's day, but they were not complex or compound. And the workers, of course, in the modern era, because they abolished slavery, basically, and the workers were employed to make these machines work. So you had one worker would work all day just doing this, pulling the lever on a machine. And that worker was paid a wage, and to maintain that, to run that complex machine. So that's where the great theorists like Marx came in. Just looked at how this was exploitive, that the worker wasn't paid for what they actually did, and what was skimmed off the top of that worker's labor was put into the capital and furthered the innovations that would, the competitive circumstances, so that new kinds of machines were produced. So things got faster and faster and faster and faster. And that's where we're at now, with all this incredible acceleration happening, with all of these different kind of technologies and these many different kinds of algorithms, that whole, the subjectivity of the worker and the capitalist employer is evaporating, because there's that kind of subject is no longer working. We live in a gig economy. There's no such thing as guaranteed lifetime employment. Most people are living from paycheck to paycheck, and they have temporary situations, and that's creating a different kind of subjectivity. And I think that's what he's tracking, is these new kind of subjectivities and new kinds of metaphysics, because a lot of our system rides on the invisible work of many people who are not being taken care of. And I think that's what's happening with all this commodification of just about everything. There's some things like our oceans. How are you going to put a price tag on something like the ocean? This is, I think, the bind that current capitalist neoliberal ways of thinking are in right now, because they don't have an answer to that. And we don't have a whole lot of time to figure it out. So we're sort of all in this bind, and it could be a nightmare, or it could be creative. It could be hugely creative if we can handle these Mobius strip kind of paradoxes that we're in.
I remember so I go back to the Nora Bateson line on, can't remember what it is, but twisting and turning in our transformations. So the thing, of course, is, I mean, I agree with, I didn't take part in that. I haven't read the material on this other person that you were talking about, but I certainly do believe that we are headed for a transformation, social transformation. But the thing about the transformation business is that up until the transformation occurs, you're in a world that you understand, and that everything is sort of works out, and you can sort of figure things out. But once the transformation happens, it's going to be a very, it takes you into a very, very different place. And it can happen very quickly. It takes a long time for the preparation work to happen for all of that. But So, I mean, and literally we are faced with a situation where, like it or not, we're going to get a transformation. The question is the transformation going to allow us to survive in a new mode of functioning, or is it going to be a transformation that essentially puts us into a steep decline? And there's not a lot of, so, but the transformation is coming one way or the other, so.
So it's that bifurcation where the system has to go in one way or the other.
We're in it. We're in a planetary double bind, literally. Right. And the way out of the double bind, as we've sort of discussed here, is to, as you say, sort of weave into the double bind and then steer it into a double bind that leads you out of it by a creative solution. But you can't do that in any sort of incremental way. It requires a constant pressure, because that's what the bind is about, is creating a pressure, right? And then it will move, it will flip quickly. And we're probably, I don't know, it's hard to tell on time wise, but if I rely on the timing that I set out in my book, which I haven't published yet, which I wrote 15 years ago, I said that the transformation, we were headed for the transformation around 2030 to 2040.
That's what Devor says. He says.
I think that's the time frame, the muddle or the mess or whatever you want to, we're in now is the prep time. It's the time where all of these forces are coming together and they will have to transform. And the analysis that I did 15 years ago was a systems analysis. And even then when I wrote it, I said, well, the closer we get to the transformation, the harder it is going to see that it's coming, because everything will get messed up and muddled up, and you'll just see the leaves. You won't be able to see the forest. But from a systems perspective, back in 2005, when I wrote the text, you could see the larger picture from a systems perspective, right?
Is this in your novel? Is this
No, it's not. It's something I wrote before my novel. It's my it's this other book that I've been thinking of trying to get finished and out. It was called Living in the 21st Century.
So I'd like to introduce an idea that might tie in with what you're talking about, and it's not necessarily one we have to go too deep into, but it's an article by Kevin Kelly called Mirror World, which I wrote a little thought piece on it a few weeks ago. Nobody responded to it.
I read it.
Yeah, and
I had problems with it.
Yeah, I have plenty of problems with it, but if he is, let's imagine that he's correct. Of course, this is infinite possibilities, same as the internet. So I forgot the first stage he talks about, but essentially the second is internet, and the third will be AR or augmented reality. So one of my positive imagined examples is we have this technology right now, very limiting, flat screen. The most we can do is stand up on a chair and dance around and try our best at inflecting our voice and showing each other emotion this way. So I'm imagining AR to actually allow some sort of time travel. We would be in the same room with each other right now, with bodies present. And I haven't paid attention to virtual reality in 5-10 years, so I don't know if this is a line of thinking that's already been explored. But so we would be sitting at a cafe table, perhaps, drinking our coffee together. And we could interact with each other in so many different ways. Or I could take an AR walk in New York and leave messages for John to find on his favorite tree that he passes by on 25th Avenue, whatever it might be. And he would get that, and it'd be a fun game we'd play. But if we were to, what Kevin Kelly's talking about is almost anything, you'd be going around with some sort of augmented reality. Anything could be labeled. I'm imagining advertisement would be running amok and all sorts of mess. So if you were in that world, of course, it's not going to change the physical world to a certain extent, but it would be, based on what he's saying, an entirely new way. And I guess his closing message was, well, let's get exploring and kind of take the reins before maybe the big guy takes over, like Facebook and Twitter and all that happen. Of course, there's infinite possibilities of disaster that come with it, but in a way, I can see it happening. I'm not going to explore it too much, but I wouldn't mind talking about it more. But I see it. It ties in with maybe what this infinite possibility, these anterior futures are talking about, this way out of our ecological bind, whatever. But I had something I wanted to say that tied in everything. So I'll stop there right now. Maybe some of that made sense as to how that world would be important, for better or for worse. And it's maybe within a 15, 20-year reach.
I'm just a little bit skeptical that that the issue is technology. So if I go back to the systems perspective, from the systems perspective, now of course we all know that technology has these. I mean, what's interesting actually about technology is not what it is designed to do. It's its unintended consequences that is what is the real power of tech, where it has a real impact. What it's designed to do is fairly straightforward, but its unintended consequences are the ones that we have to pay attention to.
Right.
And maybe
that's what I'm saying. The unintended would be what brings us into this.
Yeah, but they're hard to predict.
Right.
The unintended ones are really hard to predict. And the technology changes go side to side with the social changes. And it's the social changes that are, in a sense, where the double binds we're talking about have more to do with the social interactions between people than they have to do with technologically mediated interactions between people. And so I think that the profound transformations that we're facing as a society is in the area where, because all the pundits are paying attention to the technology, but I don't think that's where the change is coming at all. I think the technology is almost a kind of a red herring, a kind of a parallel change that will happen and will have some transforming effects. But the key issues, I think, are in the social arena, not in the social and economic arena, because I think the change that's coming is not just a social change, but it's an economic change. It's a fundamental change in the way our social economies are constructed. It's a post-capitalist world, not in the sense of capitalism fading away. It's a completely different way of having the economy organized. And that's what we're headed for, is a complete change in that level. That's why it will not look the same as the world that we live in. Because if the economy is not structured the same way and doesn't operate the same way, nothing will look the same. You know, anyway.
I just wanted to respond. Doug, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, just a quick question, which it might tap a whole different can of worms, but do you not see the social and technological paralleling? At least if we were to imagine two worlds of social interaction, the technological world, we're doing it right now. This is a huge part of my social life, interacting with the two of you here, or whoever else is here. And in the other room in this library, I might say hello to somebody in the library, or pass by and smile, whatever it might be. So and I don't like technology to the extent that I haven't bought a new computer or anything for 5 years. I wait till things explode. And I know that's limiting the definition of technology, but so there is the real world. There's maybe direct friends, direct family, direct colleagues. And then there's this second life, so to speak, of the technology world that is almost more social than the real world. But yeah, I'll leave it there. So I don't know.
I don't know how to answer that bit, but because I understand the issue, but I just think that technology is not the driver. Technology is there, and the driver operates through technology. But people tend to think that technology is the driver, and I'm not convinced of that. I think it's the socioeconomic relations that are the driver.
That makes sense.
Maybe that's a bit Marxist. I don't know, but Marxist in some of its ideas. But
my question is about augmented reality. What is reality before it is augmented? What's objective? What's subjective? Who decides? So what I think Duff, what Geoffrey is saying, he says if the temperature rises 2 degrees, it'll have certain effects. 3 degrees, it'll have certain effects. If it rises 6 degrees, Manhattan, where I live, will be underwater. That's really going to screw up my commute. It'll be like living in Venice, we'll have to have rowboats. So he says this is not virtual, this is objective. I'm just quoting him here. He says, we are projecting scenarios by taking bets. Active informationalism, which is what he believes we're moving towards, is a temporality that integrates all previous realities, a generative time machine. So we can project this, and by making bets, we actually influence that objectively. This isn't just me having an out-of-body experience. So I think that's the trickiness of it. And what I believe, I think when you just make it, I don't think technology is just parallel to our embodied experience, our phenomenological investigations. I believe they're different, but they're not separate. And I think that, the Google glasses, which a lot of adolescent boys were buying up a few years back, I think it fizzled really fast. But I think there was a lot of people who didn't want to be filmed by Google glasses. So I know that, I can't remember his name, Michael Garfield, he was really fond of wearing these, and he would walk out in public, and everyone who he interacted with was being taped by the Google glasses. And a lot of people said, take that goddamn thing off. I don't want to be in your virtual reality zone. So I think these are the kind of things we're going to have, to deal with, and we are dealing with. The technology is interrupting a lot of our affective zones. By, someone's phone goes off, or someone's scrolling through their device and not listening to what you're saying. Or even here, someone is on chat while we're having a conversation, someone will report, oh, I'm going to the bathroom, or I have to go run out and do this. And, sometimes that comes as an interrupter. So a pattern starts getting interrupted enough, we have amnesia for what's going on around us. This is something that is in this text too. It talks about how we have amnesia for the bind and for the double bind. That's where if we get interrupted, We forgot that it happened, which is what happens with people who have severe trauma, rape, war, people who get hit over the head. I mean, they have a lot of this gets just erased. And so they won't have recall of it, but if they're in a similar circumstance, someone who was in Vietnam, who was surrounded, by traumatic episodes, 20 years later, he's walking down the street and he hears, a car, something, a blast or something like that in his environment. He'll go into survival mode. He'll start, attacking people as if he were a soldier in a battlefield. So we can get triggered. And this is what I think is fascinating by the three of us. We actually had a discussion about triggers. Remember this? We got together and we worked on when you get triggered, and we worked on our metaphors for that. I'll have to go back and listen to that because I think that what's valuable about our work together and the communal efforts that we're making, and we're creating an archive, we can, I hope, become more self-reflexive as a group so that the group dynamic becomes, we can go meta to the group. I think that's what's so valuable about, we can use this technology in different ways than, just passively going to, YouTube or listening to Joe Rogan's show and listening to all these people scream at each other. We can create something different where people are tuning in, paying attention to the affects, being aware of when we give or receive double messages and point that out to the other. This, I believe, could become new kind of habits so that we can break through to what Devore is calling a second order culture. So I think I'm re-enchanted by thinking of integral theory as what Sean Hargens is calling exo-studies, how we go to the outside, study the different kinds of outsides. And he's looking at UFO literature, and he's looking at, many people who have claimed to have made contact with extraterrestrials, including me. But he's looking at the subtle. He's looking at the subtle realm and the physical and the interplay between the subtle and the physical. And how there are some who are claiming, there are physical traces for the extraterrestrial, but there are also those liminal zones where it's neither physical nor subtle, that it's both objective and subjective, and it's neither subjective nor objective. This is a very different kind of way of thinking about the extraterrestrial, or I can't remember what he's calling exo-studies. But I think and our science is not equipped at all to deal with these kinds of reports, because we all know science is set up to, get certain kinds of data that's objective and quantifiable and predictable and repeatable, which none of these kind of reports can be studied in that way. But that doesn't mean they can't be studied at all. I think it means we're going to have to create a different kind of science. And I think that's exciting. And one of these reports, this is by a guy, I think he worked for the CIA or the military industrial complex. A lot of this data, by the way, is secret, and it's been collected by the military. But there's he reported that he had contact with extraterrestrials, and they told him that they were from our future. They fucked up. They failed. And they're coming here, and there's a technology available that we could use if we can take it from them. They can't give it to us because we have to be at a higher level of development than they were when they were us. So that we won't just repeat what ended up being a failure for them in that particular anterior future. I love that idea. I think it's a deep one in our culture right now, that we're getting all of these subliminal messages and these liminal zones, these report from different kinds of liminal zones. And some of these have been reported by thousands of people who saw them at the same time, same place. And they're getting very, I think that Sean Hargens is the guy I'm talking about, who I was listening to him talk about what he's calling exo studies, which is the study of the outside, and the outsider movement that I find so attractive. How those of us who are on the margins can get together now in large numbers, because we're not working out of this cookie cutter grid where CBS and NBC tell you all the news that you need to know. We're able to, from the margins, triangulate and create relationships, just as we're doing here. And I believe, we create these affective zones, safe to fail experiments. We might find something that's really workable, that could move forward this whole idea of a second order and maybe even a third order culture. It certainly makes things more interesting, that's for sure.
I just want to note that, which is often noted by Kripal and others, this, once you start reading about it, once you are thinking about these out-of-body experiences, extraterrestrial, out-of-bounds thinking, it seems to happen more often, which is very curious, very strange. I personally have noted I'm in tune with nature. This past week has been, I've taken, after jury duty, I had a chance to skip out of work, and I just took another 2-hour hike. The day before, I took a 2-hour hike, and that's an attunement I haven't been in tune with before, or recently. I climbed a tree, which I thought about doing after one of our discussions, maybe a past Bateson discussion of going to the tree level, or the yam story of the observer from the tree and seeing that the yams are getting a bit too big. So these different perspectives come when you're in tune with a certain, perhaps, part of yourself, or when other outside objects are in tune with the inside. And to bring that back, besides the stories I can share right now, such as when I started the second hike, it was the same spot where I had my bird experience. And there was another attunement, this time with trees. I was led through, normally I take the path, but I was told to hike up the mountain rather than go the winding trail that's a little bit easier. And I found this tree that it was literally speaking to me. There were words written in the tree at the time through moss. And this is no outside coffee, no drugs, nothing like that. This is just me walking in the forest with the rational mind occurring while this was occurring. So what do I do with it? I tell you, the two of you here. Yeah. So to have these experiences, we need a framework for it. And there's so much pointing, not just with extraterrestrial or out-of-body or natural, strange, weird studies, strange occurrences, not just in that realm, but almost anywhere, especially with the ecological crisis. These are the stories that are folding into this movement towards the new placement. So we can imagine we're being enfolded into that time frame, the space that's created there. And we can, all I can do is, I guess, go along for the ride and tell others about it. But yeah, and that's where I want to explore a bit more, as we've been doing. Sorry, Geoffrey, we keep bringing up Loeffler, but this idea of, but it's a science fiction idea. It's speculative fiction of placing yourself in that environment and making it a real occurrence. And that, to me, seems to be the most real environment you can exist in, as long as all the others around you seem to be included in that, whether they're listening to your stories or not.
I think that's interesting, Doug, what you're just sharing. And also, if you have the time, Geoffrey, there's an interview that we did with Davor, which is very, I think it's user-friendly. If you have an interest, you don't have to read the article, which is a really tough one to read, but there is an interview with him that Doug and I did last week. But you were talking about having a framework for these kinds of experiences. And you're talking about your nature, I would say this like nature mysticism that you're describing. And your telepathic rapport with the bird. And I think these kind of teaching, this interspecies kind of teaching moments are, you know, I think are very deep, hardwired in us. We're really hardwired for these transcendent experiences and these different kinds of communiques from the field of all possibility. I think we've been practicing this too in our writing groups and with quantum poetics and what I've been doing with clean language. So I really want to create the conditions where we can have frameworks so that we can socialize these experiences. I think that we're already having them. Some of us are having lots of them. And they're not that extraordinary. They're the new ordinary. But I think these are not socialized yet. And we don't have the frameworks for them yet. So that we can hopefully, when we release ourselves from the taboo, that these are things that are schizophrenic, only schizophrenics report. And I think Bateson really does look at schizophrenia and also poetry, and how poetry is in some ways a lot like schizophrenic communications. But the mystics and the poets are not schizophrenic. But there's some overlap there. And I think that's very interesting. But I just wanted to, hopefully we can create safe to fail experiments such as this so that we can properly name and give blessings to that which we had not been able to express in public spaces. And I think there's a certain risk involved, but there's a great reward that comes from taking that risk. And I think that's what we're doing here in many of our groups. We're creating the conditions where we can properly name and bless what has been taboo. And I think this is what I would call triangulating from the margins. I also just want to add something about the Diagnostic Statistical Manual and multiple personality syndrome, which is considered a pathology. And of course, homosexuality was also at one time considered a pathology. So I have big question marks about who decides what is pathological. And I believe that multiple personality syndrome, it has been reported that persons with this syndrome, they can have different personalities. Their shoe size can change. Their eye color can change. They can have allergies. One personality in the same body can have an allergy, can be allergic to orange juice. Another personality with the same body can drink orange juice. These, I believe, are magical capacities. And if we could start maybe to take it out of the category, as homosexuality once was a pathology and no longer is considered a pathology and is no longer criminalized, what would happen if we start to think of multiple personality syndrome as not a syndrome, but something everyone could call upon just the way actors who put on makeup and costume go out and might perform a crazy person or a serial killer or whoever, but then can take the makeup off and take off the costume and go home. We might be able to use these kinds of capacities in amazing ways. And I think this is what Aurobindo was doing when he was talking about the supermind, that we would have access to these liminal zones. I'm sort of paraphrasing what I think he was going to this. We could have access to these liminal zones rather than have amnesia for them. And then we could bring the information, which sometimes is taboo, we could bring those into a public space and then name properly and bless rather than reject and split off from and have amnesia for. I believe we would be a different kind of human, that's for sure. And I believe there's a lot of creative possibilities in rethinking and reorganizing. Because I consider myself, I think of myself as a consortium of many different intelligences. And I have some access to it. Sometimes I can put it into words, sometimes I cannot. And as we all know, as writers and as poets, we enter into zones that are mysterious because we just don't have any vocabulary for this. And it's very easy, if you don't have a vocabulary for it and you don't bother to write it down, it vanishes very quickly. So I think it's great that we're coming together and taking these liminal spaces seriously and trying to express from those spaces rather than just talk about them in very abstract ways. And I think that's what poetry does at its best. And what we're doing when we're communicating at our best is we're coming from those liminal spaces and creating conditions where we can create new vocabularies. So it's a tall order, but I think we're doing the best that we can, and with a little bit of support that we've got. But I think that if we support each other, we might be able to get to this next level that I think Bateson, both Nora and Gregory are pointing out, that are features of a very real reality.
So we are coming up to, I think we've been at it for 2 hours, even though our late start. So and I'm thinking maybe need to close this up, but I am struck still by the fact, reading about these chapters on Bateson, that this is so profound, this work that he did, and yet, although people, again, there's a lip service given to his ideas, but there's nobody really doing systematic double-bind analysis of the kind of thing that we've been talking about in a larger view. Not a lot of it out there, and there should be, because these ideas have been around for, he wrote this 60 years ago, and so it's I think it's a good thing that we're diving back into this, because there's a need to bring these ideas and use them in a much more systematic way than they have been, I think, or it's like they've been neglected or forgotten or put to one side, somehow less important. And I don't know, I'm a bit in some ways shocked when I reread this work that
it's been marginalized.
Yeah,
I think you have to have a little bit of an outsider in you to find this interesting.
And you're talking about in the larger perspective, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Not just for, because he's talking about a very specific context in the treatment of people with mental illness or whatever. But the discussion we have is a much more broad-ranging discussion, and the lessons here are just as applicable in this broader context, even more so in a way than they were in the very particular context. And there's not enough of this discussion out there, so.
And I would agree with you. And I've have trouble reading Gregory Bateson, at least, simply because it's almost too simplistic, or it's only talking about one specific thing, but the application for it is clear, and I it's almost intuitive what he's writing. So when I read it, it's a little difficult to.
It's intuitive,
for me at least.
But who among our friends and colleagues and really understands double binds to talk about it at the level that we've been talking about it today?
Right, and I think you just said a second ago that it's just not social. It's not. There's no language for it, as you're saying, and that's the difficulty. And so I like the term Johnny used of socializing our experiences, and that is the language and the shared experience, at least for me at this point.
Yeah,
that's all.
So we'll have more of an opportunity to discuss it, because several of the sessions the coming weeks will re-deal with these issues. I think the next one is more on schizophrenia, so we'll have other opportunities to talk about this more and come back on the issues. I must admit that I was slightly distracted today because I got other things going on, but I will watch the recording, and I promise to be more attentive next time.
And I'll go back into the archive and look at our previous clean language question, working with triggers.
Yeah.
I have total amnesia for that. I don't remember it. So thank God we have an archive so that we can have a different.
I remember the drawing.
Yeah. Do you remember it?
I do. Yeah.
I have a felt sense of it, but it's great that we have this technology so that we can.
Yeah, it helped us get over some of our. It helped me get over some of my reservations about certain subjects, I think. Anyway, I think we have a wonderful time with these discussions. I love going over these issues with you guys, especially with John, your deep understanding of many of these topics as they apply to your own life, which is also very interesting.
Oh, I think it's very rewarding for me to be with peers who are able to hold the space for other person's development and to offer sponsorship, the skills of sponsorship to one another, which I think is extremely rare. And we're only just scratching the surface. So I think this is a real adventure in consciousness that we're embarked on. Thank you.
So I guess next time, I'm happy to lead next time if people want me to, or...
It's up to you if you want to, or Doug, if you want to. What's the next chapter? It's
more schizophrenia, I think.
The group dynamics of schizophrenia, minimal requirements for a theory of schizophrenia, and then 4 of Nora Bateson's. Well,
I love this. He gets into the first law of thermodynamics, which I'm always very shaky about. I never quite have understood entropy and negentropy.
That's the second law, not the first law.
Oh, yeah, that's the second law.
Yeah, but I think it is entropy that he's talking about there. So
I'm totally fascinated by that.
I do know something about that, so I could certainly.
That would be great.
I'd prefer you lead.
Why don't I lead that one, because it's close.
And I'll be glad to lead future ones. Because I love this double bind, triple bind stuff. There's one on the double bind coming up.
Well, the next one after that, I think, is the double bind, and it's the one where we want to come back and pick up the Deutero learning piece that we skipped over, which I did read, and it's not quite as deep in some ways as some of his other work, but I think it's a good supplement to what we're doing. So
I'll be glad to volunteer for that one, the Deutero learning, because I've done a lot of research on that one.
That would be great.
Background there that I could share with you, some experiments actually that might be fun.
Yeah.
And Doug, if you find a chapter you're attracted to, please let us know.
So you let the two of you take the lead at this point.
I have to say, Doug, that I was thinking about you last night when we were talking about the writing, and I was thinking to myself, you know, because you're the one who sort of says, "Oh, I'm not really a writer, and I'm taking part in this stuff, but I'm not really a writer." And I was thinking, you know, I bet Doug is the sleeper writer in the group, the one who will really kick the ball out of the park.
I have something that's beyond my thing.
When it comes to fruition, you're going to knock the socks off everybody, you know? So
looking.
no pressure.
I'm ready.
I want to watch the video of that. I missed it last night because I was getting ready for this.
Yeah.
I was exhausted after Deborah Loeffler. We did that interview and then we did the cafe, and I was cooped out. So I need a day to just recoup.
But we had a really good, I do recommend you listen to what we did, because it was a very interesting discussion that we had.
Good. I hope to join you guys the next time.
Yeah.
I look forward to that.